Okay, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11, Section 7, Means and Midpoints. How do we find and use the midpoint of a segment? After you watch the video, go to page 692, do problems 3, 5, 6, and 8. The simple version of a midpoint is the midpoint on just a plain line segment. If I want to find the middle between two numbers, I just add the two numbers and divide by 2. Now that's the simplistic view of this. So if we look at this, they added 77 and 90 and divided it by 2, and that's how they figured out what the midpoint was on this one. We're not going to be using midpoints on a line segment very much. We're going to be using midpoints on the coordinate plane. It's very similar to what we're talking about here, or what we were talking about with the number line. We just have two number lines. We're going to have 2 points, x1, point 1 and point 2, which would have x1 and y1 and x2 and y2. And what we want to do is we just want to find the midpoint of these lines. So if I'm looking at the midpoint of DE, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take -3 and -3 and add them together. So -3 plus -3 is going to give me -6. I'm going to divide -6 by 2. So I'm going to divide by 2, and that's going to give me -3 plus -3 makes -6. -6 divided by 3. I'm right back at -3 again. So the first coordinate of that midpoint is -3. Now the second coordinate of that midpoint, for the y, I would add my two y's together, which would be 5 plus -1. Well, 5 plus -1 is going to give me 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So the midpoint of that segment is the point -3, 2. We have another one right here. If you notice, this is a horizontal line, and if I do the y, 3 plus 3 is 6, and 6 divided by 3, but let's look at the midpoint of BC. To get the x-coordinate of BC, I would add 4 and -2. That's going to give me +2, and then I'm going to take +2, and I'm going to divide it by 2. So my midpoint for the x is going to be 1. So if I'm going to write the midpoint, the x-coordinate is 1. Well, the y-coordinate, I notice, has to be 3. So the y-coordinate, the midpoint of that segment is 1, 3. That's the midpoint formula on the coordinate plane. Now, how are we going to use this midpoint formula? Here's an example of when we might want to find the midpoint. They're giving me point A, which is 2, -1, point B, which is 6, 7, and they want me to write an equation of a perpendicular bisector of AB. So I need to know two things. First off, since I want a perpendicular bisector, for bisector, I'm going to need to know what the middle of this line is going to be. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to find the midpoint. So I would take my two x's and add them and divide by 2. Take my two y's and add them and divide by 2. So I find out that the midpoint is the point 4, 3. The other part is the perpendicular part, which we talked about in the first segment. For it to be perpendicular, I'm going to have to find the slope. And that's what I was doing right here as I was calculating the slope. I got -8 over -4. That's going to give me +2. So the perpendicular slope is -1 over 2. Now we're going to have to go back to our algebra skills, which some of us might have forgotten. To put this in, this is my slope, this is m, this is an x, and this is a y. So if you think about slope-intercept formula, it's y equals mx plus b. So I'm going to substitute in 3 for y, -1/2 for m, and 4 for x. The only number that I don't know is the y-intercept. So I'm going to continue calculating this. So negative 1/2 times 4 is negative 2. To find b, I'm going to have to add 2 to both sides, so I get b is 5, and then I write the equation. And whenever I write the equation, I've got the perpendicular slope. This is where it's going to cross the y-axis, but it will go through the point 43. So if you would graph this line, you would find out that this line would go through the point 43 and would have this equation right here. Another thing that you might have to do is you might have to find, say, the center of a circle. If they would give you the diameter and give you a point on each side of the circle, you could find the midpoint, and that would give you the center of the circle. So that might be something else that you might need to use midpoint for, is finding the center of a circle off of a diameter. This one is just a little bit different. They tell me that I want to find the midpoint of segment AB. They give me A, and they tell me what the midpoint is, but they don't tell me what B is. So I know to get B, I'm going to have an x-coordinate, and I'm going to have a y-coordinate. So here's where I was calculating what my x-coordinate would be. A is negative 6, and I don't know what B is, but I know if I divide it by 2, I'm going to get 4. So I would just go through the calculation, and that's going to tell me that my x-coordinate is 14. The same thing for the y-coordinate. I know that A is 3, I don't know what B is, but I do know that if I divide it by 2, I'm going to get 7, so I work out the equation. So I find out that point B is the point 14, 11 on the coordinate plane. So this is another example of using the midpoint in a slightly different way. Okay, so we've talked about 3 different ways to use the midpoint. Sometimes we just want to find the midpoint. Sometimes we need to find the center of our circle using the midpoint. Sometimes maybe we want to write the equation of a perpendicular bisector and using the midpoint. And then we have this example right here that while we had the midpoint, we needed to find the other end. So now that you've listened or watched the video, please go to page 692. Page 692, do problems 3, 5, 6, and 8.